So here we are today at Drums and Wires. I've got Steve Peer from Maine, USA, and we're going to Swindon. Now, Swindon isn't somewhere that everyone knows, but I know it quite well here. And if you've watched the series, BBC series, The Office, you'll be familiar that David Brent talks about Swindon in glowing tones, where he's welcoming the team from Swindon to Slough. And he says, "Oh, I heard they dropped a nuclear bomb on Swindon, £20 of damage done." That's terrible. So I'm going to get a lot of complaints about that from Swindonians. But Swindon did produce £20 worth of damage from a nuclear bomb. No, it didn't. But it did produce XTC, and that's what we're talking about today. Steve, which song are we going to do?
Hey, we're going to do Making Plans for Nigel. And for those loyal fans that follow us on Drums and Wires, that's our intro tune right there. And you don't actually hear the intro all the time on our show, but it does start with a fantastic drum part. There's, a heavy floor tom-tom going on with the offbeats on the hi-hat sounding very industrial, and allegedly was inspired by the Devo version of Satisfaction, which is also a very clever drum intro. And so you start out with that great drum intro and all kinds of stuff going on, written by bass player Colin, which he claims is semi-autobiographical, growing up in Swindon.
Yeah, growing up in Swindon, your parents saying, "What are you going to be?" And there's that whole phrase about, getting a job in British Steel and that. And obviously they didn't follow the advice. But he said it was like a stream of consciousness, just an amalgam of stuff that floated into his consciousness. But it's got this sort of storyline about other people making plans for other people's futures, which is the most unattractive thing if you're a teenager, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is. And again, I'm going to take your word for it about Swindon there, but I'm sure there's great people and it's a great town. And I think in the end game, all the members of XTC are really proud, but they took a lot of flack, everything from their countryside accent to coming from that small city. And, it was tough on them as a young band coming up through. They weren't from Manchester or Liverpool, or certainly not from London. And so it was difficult.
Yeah, of course. I mean, places have an aura of rock and roll, and Liverpool and Manchester do, but Swindon doesn't even have any aura about industry. It used to be in fact, Swindon used to be the birthplace of railways in Britain, but they took that away in the sort of 1950s. So Swindon had a big hole in it, like a polo. And the only company that was there in recent times was Honda. But Swindon had to, restart itself. So the idea of going to the steelworks was perhaps one of the main ideas of what you might do if you were 16. So there we go. But take us on a bit further.
Well, in 1979, they had the breakthrough single, Making Plans for Nigel, which they recorded with Steve Lillywhite. And they have really worked with some great people in the studios, one of them again being John Leckie, who we've touched on with other bands. And Brian Eno actually passed on them. I know we've talked about Brian Eno with several other shows, but he said to them, "Hey, listen, you guys have a great sound, you know what you're doing, you don't need a producer." And I think that was pretty big of Brian, because he could have gotten in there and really had a heck of a good time with the band, but said, "You guys know what you're doing, carry on."
And then they too would have had to have the sound of a grasshopper on their records. So I think we need to be grateful for that really. But XTC had sort of they never quite made it big, did they? They were sort of bobbing around in the charts here and the same there, and they did eventually do a tour on their own, but they were touring with other bands quite a lot, weren't they? So they never quite cut through in the way that perhaps they should.
And it was funny too, because they did do a tour with the Police. And not just a tour where the Police were in a van on their first tour. They opened up, some of the bigger arena shows. So they absolutely established a fan base here in the United States and a lot of credibility. And someone like myself, who I'd seen XTC in a smaller club in Long Island, New York, my father's place. I mean, I was completely convinced that they were the biggest band in the UK. First of all, because they were just fantastic. And secondly, I was just like, well, of course. I mean, these guys are just so great. They've got to be. Not that fame is that important, but I just thought that they were more established than I thought. And I really just realized that in the past couple of weeks talking with you, as you just said, that they were on the fringes. Although Andy Partridge certainly today is really looked upon as the godfather of Britpop. Britpop meaning like, you know, Pulp and Blur and Oasis and so forth. So it's all come around.
Their influence is enormous, but they didn't quite cut through. And I think there was some diffidence about wanting to write, you know, pop songs. I think when they signed to Virgin, they were keen for them to maximize their talent, and they sort of always wanted to be slightly different and never quite fitted a particular genre or mold at the time. It's one of those things that some artists are rather good at, actually.
Yes, and I really think that they were able to do a lot of cross pollination, you know, from 75 to 80. You know, gathering stuff from a lot of different bands, and some people have, you know, would be criticized for doing such a thing, but I think they had such a not sneaky, but they had such a covert way of kind of borrowing things and making it their own. And plus, they had you know, endless ideas. I mean, everybody in the band, you know, was pretty much a songwriter, a contributor, and so forth, and you know, really came up with some fabulous stuff. And Nigel was super catchy song. I mean, yeah, anybody that heard it would take one listen, and you were sold on XTC.
Well, it's endured for me because just this week, this is obviously the serendipity of what we do here, or the synchronicity, to quote the Police. But over in your country, I've been making plans for Nigel this week because we've had our Nigel Farage has gone to your country to speak to the world about, you know, bringing back the president and what have you. And we all bought tickets to see Nigel.
Oh.
We were making plans for Nigel, but unfortunately I didn't execute my plans because I forgot that I have to go to Pittsburgh in order to actually get to see him. And I mistook Pittsburgh with Pitsea, which is in Essex. It's an easy mistake to make. And about 3,000 people made the same mistake. So sadly, XTC were certainly not just the biggest band in Swindon, but, you know, one of the bigger bands in the UK. But Nigel had the worst kind of support act. He had 14 people came to see him, but out of 3,000 people who committed to buy these tickets. So we did make for plans for Nigel, but if we extend the XTC vibe here, a plan is only any good if follow through with action, and we didn't. I'm really sorry, Nigel. So I'm going to cut that now and just mix straight to Richard Branson and Generals and Majors, because one of my favourite people who does get more than 14 people is Richard Branson, and he signed them to Virgin. And in the video for Generals and Majors, they're all sitting around trying to describe the song. It seems to be a bit political, the Generals and Majors song, but that's another great song of theirs, isn't it?
Yeah, that certainly is. And I think all this stuff that you're talking about, it all comes down to mental health. Let's face it. You know, we're all crazy. They're all crazy. Oh, you know, what are you going to do? And unfortunately, for a very long stretch of time, Andy Partridge was addicted to Valium. Probably started out as a good idea, but it eventually kind of brought him down. And I think, you know, maybe one of the classic stories, and again, I look forward to our listeners correcting me, Hollywood Bowl, couldn't go to bed, sort of paralyzed, you know, really. It was very, very sad. And the rumor in the United States was, oh, Andy Partridge, you know, he's just got stage fright. You know, he just can't do it anymore. That's total BS. I mean, that band probably did more touring than anybody. And, you know, you don't just all of a sudden get stage fright. I mean, you kind of have it and it sticks with you and that's it. I mean, these guys did gig after gig after gig after gig. It was endless. However, you know, Valium really took them down. And yeah, I mean, you're the mental health expert. I mean, that's really debilitating stuff.
I grew up on Syd Barrett, not in the same house, obviously, but you know, I mean, so pressure produces all sorts of strange effects, and some people it's good for them, but you know, the pressure of touring which they experience, plus some, you know, some medication designed to help cope with it, eventually it sort of falls to bit. And sometimes he's, as you say, he's fine now, but sometimes this stuff can be tragic, really, that people's way of coping with pressure. And that's something that, you know, we could explore. If people want to have us come and talk to them in their companies, we can translate what rock and roll's like to the normal life of being under pressure as a business person. But that's for another time. But yeah, Syd Barrett is the ultimate one that just really disappeared. But Andy Partridge came back, didn't he?
Yeah. And Andy did think he was sort of turning into Syd Barrett, like maybe, you know, maybe this is my destiny. You know, I'm going to end up like this, you know, kind of crazed lunatic and being mocked, or at least at the very least misunderstood. So it was pretty sad. But again, in the end, everything has turned out pretty good. I mean, you go back to Partridge's early days as a teen. He was pretty well known in Swindon, doing a good version of Rocky Raccoon by the Beatles. He was heavily influenced by the Monkees and even the Mahavishnu Orchestra. So imagine this stuff. I mean, he's got this pop element in his head, and then he's got like John McLaughlin and Billy Cobham and that, you know, monstrous jazz fusion, Mahavishnu Orchestra kind of ringing in his head as well. And that's what makes Andy Partridge, and that's what really probably ultimately makes a lot of what we hear today with XTC. And as a final little note about the Monkees, who I'm quite a fan of as well, he did put a couple songs, or at least one song, on their latest album, which was, I think, in 2016 or something. So what kind of came around in his head, or goes around in his head, kind of came around in his head. And in the end, everything seems to be good for all members of XTC. I haven't heard anything tragic or sad. So, you know, more power to you guys, man. You're a great band.
Thank you, XTC. Thank you, Nigel. And do click and subscribe to the channel, and find us again every week or so. We do Drums and Wires. We are Steve Peer and Peter Cook. Thank you so much.